do 0.0.0.0 and represent the same thing? I use netstat in Windows to view the listen ports for TCP and UDP. I notice that in the foreign address column, UDP displays column instead of 0.0.0.0 column 0. Do these two values represent the same thing? If so, then why does UDP display column instead of 0.0.0.0 column 0?
It has been pointed out that my answer was in error. Since I cannot delete it, I will instead provide the correct one. The expression, column, means any address, any port. All UDP listeners will display this signature. This is due to the connectionless nature of UDP. Original, incorrect, answer. Yes and no. Column refers to any IP6 address. The distinction between an unknown/unspecified address is vague in IP4, so we use 0.0.0.00 to represent any host on the network, but in IP6 there is a subtle difference. For the most part, however, people use column to represent a contiguous string of zeros. In an IP6 address, any sequence of contiguous zeros can be replaced with column so 0.0.0.00 equals NGT 0.0000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000 Fe column 000 column 000 column 000 column 2000 column 0 F column Fe 7 column 0 F7 C equals NGT Fe column 2000 column 0 F column Fe 7 column 0 F7 C. The representation using wildcards, however, allows a finer control of address patterns. For instance, column would not match Fe column 2000 column 0 F column Fe 7 column 0 F7 C, but column will. This difference isn't really meaningful to any device that isn't performing routing, but when it comes time to select optimal routes to aggregated address spaces, the wildcard notation allows more flexible selection of destination networks.
The refers to the subnet netmask, which is part of the IP layer. The column refers to a port which is part of the transport layer. For TCP, it makes sense that there is a remote end for a connection. UDP, since it is connectionless, it doesn't make any sense for it to show a foreign address. My gut feeling is that it would always show the wildcard for UDP and that it is potentially there to make parsing the output a little more friendly, or to show if you are using IP4/6. IP4 column versus IP6 column.
In both cases, the information is basically meaningless, but indicates more or less the same thing. Your first line is a TCP listen socket. The local address column indicates the address and port that it's accepting connections on, and the remote address column means nothing because a listen socket has no remote end of the connection yet. A connected TCP socket would show the address of the other end of the connection in that column, but for a listen socket it decides to display an all-zero address and port. Your second line is a UDP socket. UDP is a connectionless protocol, meaning that it sends and receives packets without any notion of who connected to who, whether the packet is part of an existing conversation, or whether the data just arrived out of the blue. The local address column has the same meaning as it does for TCP, and the remote address column is meaningless because a UDP socket could have one peer, many peers, or no peers at any moment. Actually, POSIX has the notion of a connected UDP socket, but that's getting a bit far afield. Now the question, why do they display differently? It seems to be nothing more than a quirk of the Windows netstat code. Linux, NetTools, netstat displays 0.0.0.0 column for the remote end of both TCP listen sockets and UDP sockets. For IP4, it displays column for IP6, which is different from either example on Windows, but at least it's consistent within the same program. Perhaps Windows is going for a semantic distinction between to be filled and later in the case of TCP and open to anything in the case of UDP, but just as likely the two bits of code were written by two different people with no particular concern for consistency.
The difference is simply notational. Netstat in Windows uses 0.0.0.0 column 0 to represent an abstract idea of a remote address and port for a local IP4 TCP listener and column for a UDP listener. For IP6, the remote address is denoted by column 0 for TCP and column for UDP. In OS X, dot is used for both TCP and UDP, whether IP4 or IP6. Note that OS X uses dots to separate address and port. Linux uses 0.0.0.0 column for IP4 and column for IP6, with the first two colons representing the abbreviation for all IP6 address and the third colon the separator between the address and the port. Yet from something I heard or read long ago, I think UDP pairings can show up, but usually don't because they are torn down upon completion and UDP connections are usually very short, lasting milliseconds or less. I've never seen this myself, though, so it could be incorrect.
If you want to support PJ Hanna, please consider subscribing.